The courtroom was unusually tense that morning. Fluorescent lights flickered above rows of polished oak benches, casting a sterile glow over the federal hearing chamber. The judge's bench loomed high, flanked by the flags of the United States and the state of Virginia. Cameras were not permitted, but nearly every major outlet had a reporter scribbling furiously in the back. Not because of who was on trial, but because of who was going to testify. Amelia Hartley adjusted the microphone before her, her fingers trembling slightly. She was 26 years old, dressed in a plain navy blouse and black slacks, nothing flashy. But the gold star pin on her lapel said everything. Her father, Master Sergeant Daniel Hartley, had died in combat the year she graduated high school. A decade later, his name was now being dragged through bureaucratic mud. At the center of the case was a controversial posthumous investigation, a retroactive review claiming Hartley's final unauthorized evacuation of civilians during an ambush had violated wartime engagement protocols. It was a political play, some said. A cleanup operation. Others insisted it was about accountability. Amelia had flown in from Wisconsin with a single goal: speak the truth. She was not on trial, but it felt like she was. Across the courtroom, the lead government counsel, Mr. Ellsworth, whispered something to the judge. She nodded. Judge Mariana Cole, appointed 3 years prior, adjusted her glasses and leaned forward. "Miss Hartley," she began, her voice clipped and cool, "I want to remind you that this is not a venue for personal stories or emotional testimony. Your comments should strictly pertain to the relevant operational conduct and chain of command authorization. Do you understand?" Amelia blinked slowly. She looked at her hands. Then, without flinching, she looked straight into the judge's eyes. "With respect, Your Honor," she said quietly, "my father's conduct can't be separated from the man he was, because he didn't disobey orders, he obeyed something higher. And if I'm not allowed to speak about that, then I'm not really testifying." There was a pause. You could hear the rustle of a legal pad from the front row. Somewhere, someone stifled a cough. The judge frowned and lifted her gavel, clearly preparing to redirect her. But Amelia didn't stop. "My father didn't live for protocol. He lived for people. And if you silence that part of him, then you're not just erasing a record, you're erasing a life." The gavel froze mid-air. Judge Cole's knuckles tightened around the gavel. Her lips parted slightly as if to interrupt, but something in Amelia's voice, steady, defiant, painfully composed, seemed to hang in the air like fog after cannon fire. The courtroom wasn't used to defiance, at least not from someone so young, so soft-spoken, so unshakably human. "I understand courtroom protocol," Amelia continued, her voice calm, "but what my father did that day didn't happen in a spreadsheet. It didn't happen in a briefing room. It happened with blood in the dirt and children screaming and smoke so thick you couldn't see your own hands. So if you want me to talk about chain of command, fine." She pulled out a folded letter and held it up. "This is the last letter my dad ever wrote me. He sent it the night before he died. Not to say goodbye. He didn't know he'd die. He just wanted me to understand what it meant to wear the uniform." Ellsworth stood. "Objection, Your Honor. Irrelevant." Judge Cole finally set the gavel down, but slowly, not striking it. Her face had lost some of its edge. "Approach," she said flatly, motioning Ellsworth forward. While the attorneys whispered near the bench, Amelia remained at the witness stand, the letter still in her hand. She didn't move. She didn't look at the gallery, but she could feel them, veterans, families, journalists, watching her like they were holding their breath. Behind her sat Corporal James DeVille, who had served under her father. He wasn't there to speak, just to bear witness. When Amelia glanced over her shoulder briefly, he gave her a single nod, the kind only soldiers understood. Judge Cole finally spoke, objection sustained in part. "The letter may be referred to for the purpose of illustrating St. Hartley's state of mind, not to solicit sympathy or narrative detour. Miss Hartley, please proceed accordingly." Amelia nodded, but she didn't look away. "You want to talk about his state of mind?" she said. "This letter isn't a detour. It's the map." A ripple went through the courtroom. People weren't used to hearing that kind of clarity, not in a place where lawyers danced around truth like it might bite them. She unfolded the letter, and her voice broke slightly as she began. "Mia, if you ever wonder why I signed up for another tour, it wasn't because I wanted medals or promotions. It was because I couldn't live with myself, knowing I stood by when I could have done something. If they ever tell you I broke the rules, ask them what those rules protected. Ask them who they protected. And if you can't get an answer, then maybe the rules were the problem. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth. A man 2 rows back, a former Marine in dress blues, stared straight ahead, eyes wet. Even Judge Cole didn't speak, because for the first time in that courtroom the gavel wasn't in her hands. The truth was, the room was still, like the moment before a storm breaks, not because nothing was happening, but because too much was. The judge didn't try to interrupt again. Even Ellsworth, the seasoned prosecutor known for his sharp objections and colder demeanour, had retreated into silence, flipping papers more for appearance than purpose. Amelia folded the letter gently and placed it beside the microphone. Then she leaned forward again, both palms flat on the table. "My father wasn't a perfect man," she said. "He didn't pretend to be. He'd tell you himself he made mistakes. That's why he always double-checked his gear and triple-checked his conscience. But the day you're reviewing here, the day this court has decided to dissect, was the day he made a call that saved 18 lives." She paused. Her eyes scanned the room. The press gallery was frozen, pens still. Cameras weren't allowed, but someone had started typing. She could hear it. "I have one question for this court," she said slowly, "and I want anyone to answer it." Her voice didn't rise, but it cut sharper than a shout. If my father had not disobeyed that direct order, if he had followed the rule that told him to wait, would those 18 people still be alive? A murmur rippled through the room. The judge sat back slightly. Ellsworth didn't answer. No one did. Because that's the question no one wants to ask. Because you all already know the answer, and it scares you. Amelia turned toward the gallery now, eyes wide, voice unshaking. "You're scared of the idea that sometimes doing the right thing breaks the rules. You're scared of admitting that the system you represent, this courtroom, this chain of command, these protocols, might not be perfect. Because if you admit that, then you have to admit that the heroes you punished were the ones who saved us." She faced the judge again. "Are we supposed to believe that doing the right thing only counts when it's written into a policy manual? That morality is only valid when it's approved by a committee?" Judge Cole looked like she wanted to speak, but didn't. Her mouth opened and closed again. The gallery was so quiet now you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. Amelia took a breath. "I am not here to rewrite the law. I'm here to remind you of something law is supposed to serve. Justice." And for the first time in that courtroom, even the stenographer hesitated, like she was afraid to miss a single word. In a side bench near the wall, a Vietnam veteran named Earl Montgomery tightened his grip on the brim of his hat. He had testified in courts before, decades ago, when no one listened. But now, as Amelia stood at that microphone, he found himself sitting straighter. Not because of her name, but because of her courage. It felt like watching someone carry every buried story that had been locked away in silence for 50 years and speak it out loud. Amelia wasn't finished. She took a slow breath and let her next words fall with purpose. "I've read every after-action report. I've reviewed every deposition. I've listened to every justification. But I never once found an answer to this. Why was my father punished for saving lives while others were rewarded for following orders that got people killed?" A young intern near the judge's bench dropped her pen. Silence. "I'll tell you why," Amelia said, standing now. "Because this court, this system, is terrified of people who think for themselves. People who lead with conscience, not compliance. Because if you start admitting that moral courage matters more than hierarchical obedience, then a lot of people in high places have to start answering for a lot of terrible decisions." Judge Cole slowly leaned back in her chair, fingers resting against her chin. Her face had lost the bureaucratic mask. She looked like someone seeing a truth they had buried long ago, and it was clawing its way to the surface. Amelia's voice lowered. "On the wall in our living room, above my dad's medals, there's a quote he used to point at when I asked him why he re-enlisted." She paused. "Do the right thing, even if it costs you everything, because living with yourself matters more than living under approval." She let that hang. No dramatics, no gesture, just raw truth. And then, for the first time, Amelia's eyes shimmered, but she did not break. My father's not on trial today. Not really. This is a test for you, to see if you still remember the difference between legality and justice, between policy and principle, between a rule and a soul. The door to the courtroom creaked open, and a new row of people quietly entered. Veterans, mostly. Some in uniform, some in wheelchairs, some with medals, some with scars. They didn't say a word. They just sat, as if they had heard a call not spoken aloud. And slowly, very slowly, the courtroom began to feel less like a tribunal and more like a reckoning. Amelia steadied herself, one hand on the stand. The air in the room felt different now, heavier. Not oppressive, but charged. Like something long buried had just been unearthed, and the people in that room couldn't look away. Judge Cole folded her hands together and, for a moment, stared down at them like she was searching for the right page in an invisible book. But before she could speak, Ellsworth rose again, slower this time. "Your Honour," he said, voice clipped but quieter than before, "we maintain that emotional appeals have no bearing on the statutory review of wartime conduct. The witness has gone beyond her scope." This time, there was no sharp objection from the gallery, just stillness. And the sound of an older woman whispering under her breath in the back row, "God help us if that's all we've become." Amelia turned toward Ellsworth, not angrily, but with a steady fire that no script could contain. "I am beyond the scope," she said, "because the scope is too small." Ellsworth blinked. "This isn't about emotion. It's about consequence," she said. "You want to separate facts from feelings? Then let's talk about facts." She pulled out a second paper from her binder and read it aloud. "On June 14th, 2013, my father evacuated a group of civilians, women, children, elderly, from an ambush zone that had been mistakenly marked as secure. Command had not updated the intel. He defied the standby order, entered the red zone alone, and extracted them under fire. 3 of the survivors testified last year, all living, all grateful. That is fact." She looked up. But no medal, no honour. Instead, a posthumous investigation. Amelia folded the paper deliberately. "I'm not here to decorate my father. I'm here because someone has to say it. If rules punish those who save lives, then the rules are broken." A hum of agreement moved through the gallery like wind through dry grass. For the first time, the courtroom clerk lowered her eyes, visibly emotional. Judge Cole cleared her throat, and this time she did speak. "Miss Hartley, do you believe justice can exist without accountability?" Amelia nodded slowly. "Yes, but only if you redefine accountability as truth, not punishment. And the truth is, my father answered to something higher than orders that day. He answered to life, to duty, to human decency." She stepped away from the microphone. "And if this court won't recognize that, then maybe it's not the court that needs to pass judgment. Maybe it's the country." The room fell silent again. Not out of fear, but out of awe. The silence wasn't emptiness. It was weight, the kind of silence that falls when people don't dare breathe for fear of missing something holy. Then from the back of the room, a cane tapped once against the wooden floor, slowly, deliberately. All heads turned. It was Earl Montgomery, the Vietnam veteran who had been watching in silence since Amelia stood. He rose, shoulders stiff with age, medals gleaming faintly beneath a worn blazer. He stepped forward, uninvited, and though Judge Cole didn't call for order, no one dared stop him. "Your Honour," Earl said, his voice gravelly but strong, "I served in a jungle where rules said wait while people bled out. I watched men die, following orders that never made sense, and others live because someone broke them. If Sergeant Hartley had been my CO, I'd have followed him into hell." The room held its breath. "I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a politician, but I know right from wrong. And what that girl just said, that's the most honest testimony I've ever heard in a courtroom." He looked at Amelia and gave a slight nod, not of pity but of solidarity. And then he turned, walked back to his seat and sat down again like nothing unusual had occurred. But everything had changed. Another man stood up next, then a woman, then 2 more. Veterans, family members, strangers. One by one they stood, not speaking, just standing, not protesting, just bearing witness. Amelia hadn't moved. She watched it all happen as if she were outside her own body. Her hands were still on the table. Her father's letter was beside them. Judge Cole glanced at her bailiff, who whispered something, but the judge raised a hand to silence him. "No," she said quietly, "let them stand." Ellsworth looked around, visibly unnerved. This wasn't the kind of courtroom drama he was trained for. His rulebook didn't cover this. The judge slowly leaned forward again. "Miss Hartley," she said, her voice measured but softer than before, "you speak of conscience, of moral courage, and yet you challenge the very institution meant to uphold justice." Amelia looked up, her expression calm. "I'm not challenging the institution, Your Honor. I'm asking if it still remembers what it was built for." The judge stared at her for a moment, then slowly leaned back in her chair. No one dared speak next. Because whether the court wanted to admit it or not, Amelia Hartley had just put the entire system on trial. The walls of the courtroom, thick with tradition, law, and reverence, suddenly felt thinner, not because of disrespect, but because truth has a way of making even marble seem like paper. Judge Cole sat perfectly still. Her fingers pressed together in front of her lips, her eyes locked on Amelia. But this time, her gaze wasn't commanding. It was questioning, not of Amelia, but of herself. "I was a public defender once," the judge finally said. "Years ago, before the robes, before the chambers. I used to sit across from men and women who'd done what they thought was right, and been punished for it anyway. The gallery was frozen. And I remember thinking," she continued slowly, "that if the law can't make room for decency, then it's only half a law." Amelia didn't speak. She didn't have to. Ellsworth cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Your Honor, with due respect, this line of reflection—" "Is noted," she interrupted, her voice firmer now, but not directed at Amelia. "Counsel, step back." Ellsworth's jaw tightened, but he obeyed. The judge turned back to the young woman before her. "What would you have this court do, Miss Hartley?" she asked. "What do you believe justice looks like in this case?" Amelia's reply came without hesitation. "Justice," she said, "isn't about clearing my father's name. His name is already clean. It's about clearing our conscience as a country. If we punish the men and women who risk their lives for others simply because their choices don't fit inside neat legal boxes, we are telling the next generation of service members to choose obedience over humanity." Her voice lowered, but became more powerful. "And when that happens, the heart of our military, our courts, our country, dies." The judge looked down, then up again. "And if this court absolves him?" Amelia shook her head. "This court doesn't have the power to absolve him. Only history does. What this court does have is the chance to admit it was wrong and choose something better. Not just for him, but for everyone who still believes that honor is worth defending." A tear rolled down someone's cheek in the front row. A stenographer, usually detached, took a moment to wipe her eyes. And behind Amelia, one of the uniformed veterans stepped forward and set something quietly on the defense table. A folded flag, freshly pressed, not from Hartley's funeral, but from his old base, sent by every surviving member of his final unit. Amelia touched the edge of the fabric, then looked up again. "This is not just a flag," she said. "It's a promise. One we keep failing, until now." For a long time no one moved. The flag lay between them, a silent testament folded 13 times, sharp and precise, just like her father would have done. Amelia rested her hand on it, as if to steady herself, but she was already the steadiest person in the room. Judge Cole exhaled slowly. You could feel the weight of years in that breath. All her years in courtrooms, behind benches, beneath seals of authority, none of them prepared her for this. Not this girl, not this truth. She leaned forward again. "I was taught to interpret the law," the judge said quietly, "not to bend it for sentiment. But I was also taught that interpretation begins with intent, and the intent of justice is not punishment, it's restoration." You could have heard a pin drop. She looked directly at Ellsworth. "Counsel, is there any reason you can provide this court, not drawn from statute but from conscience, why Sergeant Hartley's actions should continue to be officially condemned?" Ellsworth's mouth opened, but the words wouldn't come. He looked down, then closed the file in front of him. "No, Your Honor." Gasps echoed from the back rows, quiet ones. Not shock, relief. Judge Cole turned back to Amelia. "This court will recess for 30 minutes, she said. "When we return, I will issue a ruling. But let me say this now, Miss Hartley. You have reminded this courtroom, and perhaps this country, that some voices, no matter how young, carry the weight of generations." She stood. The gavel was in her hand, but she didn't strike it. She just looked at it for a moment. then placed it down gently, as if even that deserved respect. Court recessed. Amelia exhaled. Her knees almost buckled, but before she could even wobble, someone caught her. Corporal DeVille. He didn't say anything. He just helped her down from the witness stand like a soldier escorting a comrade off the battlefield. The gallery slowly emptied into the hallway, but no one rushed. They walked like pilgrims leaving sacred ground. Reporters flooded the marble steps outside, but for once the story wasn't theirs to shape. The truth had already been told. It had just one author, a daughter. And in the hallway, as the crowd parted for her to pass, veterans stepped forward, one by one, pressing their palms to their hearts or offering silent nods. She didn't cry. Not yet. But her father's words echoed louder now than ever before. Ask them who the rules protected. 30 minutes later, the courtroom was full again, but it wasn't the same room. Something had shifted. It wasn't just about Sergeant Hartley anymore. It was about every soldier who'd ever disobeyed a broken order, every medic who stayed too long in the blast zone, every commander who chose people over policy and paid for it later in silence. Judge Cole returned to the bench. She no longer looked like a judge guarding procedure. She looked like a woman who had spent her recess weighing the soul of a nation. "Be seated," she said. Her voice had changed. Not softer, fuller. Amelia sat. Her hand still rested on the folded flag. This court has reviewed the testimony, documentation, and precedent, but more importantly, it has confronted a question that the law often avoids, not because it lacks an answer, but because it fears one. She glanced at Ellsworth, then back to the room. We often say no one is above the law, but we forget that the law itself must answer to something. That something is justice. A murmur of agreement rippled through the gallery. Sergeant Daniel Hartley violated protocol. That is not in dispute, but he did so in the service of life. Not to rebel, not to grandstand, not to undermine. He did it because no one else would, because the system froze, and he moved. She paused, then spoke the words that would make headlines for years. This court hereby strikes all posthumous charges and inquiries from the record. Sergeant Hartley's record is to be restored in full honour, with commendation for extraordinary moral judgment in the field of combat. The gallery erupted, but not with shouts, not with noise, with a standing ovation, not just for a man who wasn't there, but for the daughter who brought him back into the light. Amelia didn't rise. She stayed seated, her eyes filled with tears, her hand clutching the edge of the flag. Judge Cole stood now too, and added more quietly, "This court further recommends that a review committee be formed to investigate all current punitive reviews of combat actions where humanitarian necessity was in conflict with procedural compliance." In other words, this wasn't just about Hartley anymore. It was about cleaning house, restoring dignity, and rewriting the silence. As Judge Cole stepped down from the bench, she didn't return to her chambers. She walked straight to Amelia and extended her hand. Not to lead, but to thank. "I wish I'd had a daughter like you," she said. Amelia's voice cracked. He did. Outside the courthouse, the wind had picked up. Flags that once hung motionless now rippled with quiet force, as if stirred by something unseen but deeply felt. Reporters waited for Amelia, mics raised, cameras flashing, but when the doors opened, she didn't walk out alone. She was flanked by veterans, young and old, black and white, decorated and forgotten. Men and women who had seen things the public would never understand, who had been told to obey, and punished when they dared to care. Amelia stepped to the microphones, but she didn't speak from a script. She didn't have to. "I didn't come here to fight a battle," she said simply. "I came here to tell a story, my father's, and now, maybe, yours too." She reached into her coat and unfolded the letter again, now slightly worn at the edges, but stronger than ever in message. She read just one more line. "If they ever ask who I was, don't tell them I followed every order. Tell them I followed what mattered." The cameras were quiet. Even the most hardened anchors didn't interrupt. Then a child stepped forward from the crowd. A little girl, no older than 7, holding a small American flag. She looked up at Amelia and whispered, "Was he a hero?" Amelia bent down to her level, smiled gently and replied, "No, sweetheart, he was just a good man who refused to be quiet when it counted." A hush fell over the entire plaza. Then, a sound. It started faintly. From a speaker someone had set up nearby. A slow, reverent trumpet. Taps. No one planned it, no one choreographed it, and yet one by one hundreds of people lowered their heads. Veterans saluted. Civilians clutched their hearts. Journalists set down their pens, because something bigger than headlines had happened here. Amelia stood still as the notes played, the folded flag in her arms like it had always belonged there. When the final note faded, she whispered only one thing. For all the fathers who didn't come home, and all the daughters still carrying their voice. Then she turned and walked away from the microphones, not to escape the spotlight, but because she didn't need it anymore. The story had been told, and the courtroom, once a place of silence, had become a place where truth finally spoke.